they were not defeated on the battlefield. No crusading army broke their ranks. No enemy banner replaced theirs. No holy war ended them. Instead, the Knights Templar were destroyed in silence, by paperwork, by confessions written under pressure, by judges who already knew the verdict. This was not the fall of an order. It was the moment faith itself was placed on trial. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, Templar knights across France woke up expecting routine. They were monks. They were soldiers. They were bankers, administrators, and guardians of sacred roots. They had no warning. Before dawn had fully lifted, royal officers appeared at Templar commanderies. Not with swords, with warrants. Doors were sealed. Records were seized. Men who had sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were suddenly accused of heresy. The charges were precise, too precise. Denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, idolatry, obscene initiation rites. Not accusations shouted by mobs, but accusations prepared in advance. This was not chaos. This was a prosecution. To understand what happened to the Templars, you must first understand who they had become. They were founded to protect pilgrims, but by the early 14th century, they protected something far more dangerous. They protected infrastructure. The Templars moved money across borders when kings could not. They stored wealth that monarchs desperately needed and deeply resented. They answered to the Pope, not to the crown. And that single fact made them untouchable. Until it didn't. The King of France, Philip IV, was drowning in debt. War had drained his treasury. His authority was challenged by nobles, by cities, by the church itself. He needed money. He needed control. And above all, he needed legitimacy. The Templars stood in the way of all three. So Philip did what medieval kings had learned to do well. He didn't attack faith directly. He weaponized it. The arrests were coordinated with chilling precision. Every Templar in France was targeted simultaneously. There was no rebellion, no resistance. Why would there be? The Templars trusted the Church. They trusted due process. They trusted that faith protected them, that trust would destroy them. Interrogations began immediately. Confessions followed. Some knights admitted everything, others denied it all. But the pattern was clear. Under pressure, under threat, under torture, men will say what power demands they say. And power was listening closely. What followed was not a trial in the modern sense. There were no neutral judges, no presumption of innocence. The verdict had already been written. The only question left was how convincingly it could be justified. The Pope hesitated. Clement V was no revolutionary. He did not want a confrontation with the French crown. But he also understood something dangerous was unfolding. If a king could dismantle a religious order by accusing it of heresy, then no institution under the Church's protection was safe. Not monasteries, not bishops, not even the papacy itself. This was not about guilt. It was about who held the authority to judge faith. Was it the Church? Or had secular power finally learned how to put God on trial without appearing to defy him? The trial of the Templars was not an accident of history. It was a blueprint, a moment when faith ceased to be an untouchable domain and became something that could be interrogated, documented, and dismantled, not by enemies of Christianity, but by those who claimed to defend it. And in the years that followed, Europe would learn a brutal lesson. When faith enters the courtroom, it does not come out intact. The trial did not begin with evidence. It began with confessions, and those confessions appeared everywhere, almost immediately, with disturbing consistency. Templars across France admitted to crimes they had never spoken of before. They confessed to denying Christ, to spitting on the cross, to worshiping false idols, to rituals that sounded more like nightmares than religious ceremonies. To the outside world, this looked like proof. To power, it looked like success. But confession does not mean truth. It means submission. The interrogations followed a pattern that medieval authorities knew well. First came isolation, then accusation, then pressure. When denial persisted, pressure became pain. Not chaotic violence, not rage, but methodical, regulated torture designed to produce compliance. The rack, suspension, starvation, sleep deprivation. Techniques calibrated not to kill, but to break certainty. Under such conditions, memory dissolves. Identity fractures. Faith becomes negotiable. Many Templars confessed quickly. Some recanted later. Some tried to explain contradictions. It did not matter. Once spoken, a confession had a life of its own. Written down, signed, sealed, it became legal reality. This was the brilliance and the cruelty of the process. The trial did not need to prove the accusations. It only needed to record them. When Pope Clement V demanded oversight, he encountered a finished product. Hundreds of confessions, uniform charges, detailed admissions. To intervene now would mean challenging not a king, but a mountain of documentation. And documentation carries authority, especially when it claims to reveal hidden sin. But something was wrong, very wrong. When papal investigators re-examined the Templars outside the reach of French officials, the story changed. Without torture, without immediate threat, many knights retracted their confessions. They denied the charges. They described coercion. They described pain. Some said they confessed only to stop suffering. Others said they would confess again if tortured again. Because truth was no longer the point. Survival was. This created a problem. If confessions could be undone, then the case could collapse, and power could not allow that. So the process shifted. The question was no longer, did the crimes occur? The question became, why did so many men confess? And the answer was simple. Because guilt had already been decided. In medieval law, confession was the highest form of evidence. But confession obtained under torture occupied a strange legal gray zone. It was officially discouraged, unofficially indispensable. Everyone understood the contradiction, and everyone accepted it. Because torture did not reveal truth, it revealed obedience. This is where the trial of the Templars became something new. Not a religious inquiry, not a theological debate, but a legal performance. One designed to demonstrate that authority could define reality without challenging God directly. Philip IV never declared himself judge of faith. He framed himself as protector of the Church. The charges were framed as purification. The violence was framed as necessity. Everything was wrapped in the language of salvation, and the public believed it. Why wouldn't they? The Templars were powerful. They were secretive. They were wealthy. Suspicion was easy, and fear makes people cooperative. But beneath the spectacle, a deeper transformation was taking place. Faith was no longer sacred territory. It had become admissible evidence, something to be dissected, catalogued, and condemned. The Church found itself trapped. If it defended the Templars too strongly, it risked appearing to protect heresy. If it abandoned them, it conceded that secular rulers could define orthodoxy through force. There was no safe position, so the papacy hesitated. And hesitation is fatal when power is moving quickly. The longer the trial dragged on, the clearer the outcome became. Not because the evidence was convincing, but because the structure of the process made acquittal impossible. You cannot win a trial where confession is mandatory, retraction is suspicious, and silence is treated as guilt. The Templars were learning a new lesson. Faith alone did not protect you. Institutional backing mattered, and theirs was slipping away by now. The question was no longer whether the Templars were innocent. The question was whether innocence still mattered at all. What was happening to the Templars would echo through European history. Because this was not just a trial. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept. That power could dismantle religious authority using legal instruments, moral language, and controlled violence, without ever appearing openly hostile to God. Faith had entered the courtroom. And inside that space, truth did not belong to conscience. It belonged to procedure. The illusion was complete. The confessions existed. The records were filed. The charges were formal. Justice had been performed, but the verdict was still missing. And the final decision would not be made by evidence or by theology. It would be made by political necessity. The fate of the Templars did not rest in the interrogation rooms. It rested in a quieter place, the papal court. Pope Clement V was not a weak man by temperament, but he was a constrained one. He had inherited a church already under pressure from monarchs, from cities, from the rising machinery of state power. And now he faced a crisis that threatened the very foundation of papal authority. The Templars answered directly to the Pope. They were exempt from local bishops, exempt from secular courts, exempt from royal command. That exemption was not symbolic, it was power. And Philip IV wanted it gone. At first, Clement resisted. He protested the arrests. He questioned the legality. He demanded oversight. But resistance without leverage is only delay. Philip understood something crucial. He did not need to defeat the papacy. He only needed to outpace it. By the time Clement issued formal objections, the confessions were already public. The narrative was already fixed. The Templars were not victims. They were suspects. And suspicion is contagious. Clement faced an impossible choice. If he defended the Templars absolutely, he risked a direct confrontation with France. France was not just a kingdom, it was the financial backbone of the papacy. The papal court had already been relocated to Avignon, within the gravitational pull of French power. The Pope was free in theory. In practice, He was surrounded. If Clement condemned the Templars outright, he would confirm something even more dangerous: that secular rulers could dismantle religious institutions by initiating legal processes the Church could not control. Either way, papal authority would shrink. So Clement chose delay. He convened commissions. He ordered inquiries. He asked for time. Time to examine. Time to verify. Time to preserve the appearance of control. But time was not neutral. Time favored Philip. As months passed, Templars died in prison. Others broke under renewed pressure. Public opinion hardened. The question slowly shifted from, "Are the Templars guilty?" to, "Why is the Pope protecting them?" This was the trap. The papacy was being framed not as a moral authority, but as an obstacle to purification. And in a religious society, no institution can afford to appear opposed to moral cleansing. Clement tried compromise. He suspended the order temporarily. Not condemned, not acquitted. Suspended. A legal limbo, but suspension was enough. The damage was irreversible. Without papal backing, the Templars were defenseless. Their properties were seized, their networks dismantled, their political usefulness evaporated. At the Council of Vienne in 1311-1312, the final act unfolded. Not a trial verdict, not a declaration of guilt, but something colder. The Templars were dissolved by papal decree, not because their guilt was proven, but because their continued existence was deemed too dangerous. Clement did not declare them heretics. He declared them inconvenient. This distinction matters because it reveals the truth of the moment. Faith was no longer judged solely on theology. It was judged on stability, on political cost, on whether an institution could exist without destabilizing the balance of power. The Pope had not condemned the Templars. He had abandoned them. For Clement, this was survival. For the Church, it was a precedent. From this moment forward, no religious order could assume papal protection was absolute. No institution could claim immunity from political calculation. The Church still spoke in the language of God, but it now operated inside the logic of states. The trial of the Templars did not end with flames or executions. It ended with paperwork, with signatures, with a decree that erased an order without ever resolving the truth. And that is what made it revolutionary. Faith had not been defeated. It had been administratively neutralized. Clement V did not intend to weaken the papacy. He intended to preserve it. But preservation required concession, and concession reshapes authority. The Pope survived. The institution survived. But something fundamental was lost. The idea that the Church stood above secular power. The idea that faith was untouchable by courts and kings. The idea that spiritual authority could not be overridden by political necessity. The Templars were gone. And in their absence, a new order quietly emerged. One where faith still mattered, but only so long as it did not interfere with power. The courtroom had changed everything. Philip IV of France did not invent religious persecution, but he perfected something far more effective: He learned how to destroy faith without appearing to oppose it. Philip was not a fanatic. He did not burn churches. He did not rewrite doctrine. He did not declare himself above God. Instead, he mastered a quieter art. He learned how to let institutions collapse from the inside. By the time the Templars were arrested, Philip had already tested this strategy before. He had challenged popes. He had taxed clergy. He had weaponized accusations of heresy against enemies who stood in his way. Each time, he framed his actions not as rebellion, but as defense of the faith. This was the transformation of medieval power. Kings no longer needed to confront the church directly. They only needed to speak its language better than it did. Philip never claimed the authority to judge theology. He claimed the authority to protect Christian society. That distinction was everything. In Philip's framework, heresy was not primarily a spiritual danger. It was a political one. It threatened unity. It undermined order. It weakened obedience. And anything that weakened obedience could be framed as an enemy of God. The Templars, with their independence, their secrecy, their wealth, and their immunity, were perfect targets, not because they were heretical, but because they were uncontrollable. Philip understood that brute force creates martyrs, and martyrs strengthen faith. So he avoided blood. He avoided spectacle. Instead, he turned faith into a bureaucratic problem. Forms replaced swords. Confessions replaced battles. Councils replaced crusades. This method had profound consequences because it taught Europe something new. That power no longer needed to confront belief. It only needed to regulate it. The trial of the Templars was not designed to convince theologians. It was designed to convince administrators, to create records, to generate consensus, to normalize the idea that faith could be audited. Once that idea took root, the damage spread quietly. Other rulers took note. If the King of France could dismantle the most powerful military religious order in Europe without provoking revolt, then perhaps the Church was no longer untouchable. Perhaps faith itself could be managed. Philip did not live to see the full consequences of his actions, but his method outlived him. In the centuries that followed, religious authority would increasingly be constrained not by disbelief, but by legal frameworks, by courts, by statutes, by definitions imposed from above. This did not end faith, but it changed its position. Faith became something that existed within political systems, not above them. The Templars were the first major casualty of this transformation. They were not destroyed because they lost belief. They were destroyed because belief no longer guaranteed protection, and that is why their fall matters. Not because of secret rituals, not because of hidden treasure, but because it marked the moment when religious authority ceased to be absolute. Philip had proven something dangerous: that kings could control faith without declaring war on God, that the sacred could be neutralized without sacrilege, that obedience could be extracted through process, not force. This was not secularism. It was something colder. A world where faith remained visible, respected, and celebrated, but only so long as it remained politically harmless. The Templars had crossed that line without realizing it. They believed papal protection was enough. They believed vows still mattered. They believed faith shielded them from manipulation. Philip understood something they did not. That in a changing world, faith without power is vulnerable. And power without faith can still claim divine legitimacy. The king did not destroy the church. He reshaped its boundaries. And in doing so, he accelerated a process that would redefine Europe. From this moment on, the question was no longer, what does God command? But, who has the authority to interpret it and enforce it? The courtroom had replaced the battlefield. And faith had learned that silence can be just as deadly as fire. When the final moment came, it did not arrive as a climax. There was no revelation, no confession that changed history, no truth finally uncovered. Only silence. On March 18th, 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was led to an island in the Seine. He was old, he was broken, and he had already been condemned. But something unexpected happened. De Molay spoke, not in defense of doctrine, not in protest of torture, but in rejection of the process itself. He withdrew his confession. Publicly, calmly, he declared the charges false. He denied the crimes. He affirmed the innocence of the order. This mattered. Not morally. Legally, under medieval law, a relapsed heretic, someone who recanted after confessing, was considered beyond redemption. There would be no further trial, no review, no debate. The sentence was immediate, death by fire. And just like that, the entire legal performance ended without delivering what it had promised. No truth, no clarity, no justice, only finality. The execution of Jacques de Molay did not validate the trial. It exposed its emptiness. If the confessions were true, why silence the man who spoke again? If the evidence was solid, why fear one last denial? Because the trial was never about truth. It was about closure. De Molay's death solved nothing. It did not restore faith. It did not cleanse the church. It did not resolve the contradictions. It simply removed the last living symbol of resistance. And that is why the execution mattered so little and so much. There was no uprising, no outrage. Europe did not erupt. Life continued. The machinery of power moved on. And that, perhaps, was the most disturbing outcome of all. The destruction of the Templars did not shock Christendom. It normalized something new. That religious authority could disappear without catastrophe. That an institution could be erased without divine consequence. That faith, when isolated, does not automatically command protection. The fire burned quickly. The memory did not. In the years that followed, the absence of the Templars created a vacuum. Their lands were redistributed, their roles absorbed, their functions replaced. The church adapted, the state expanded, and no one looked back. This was not a martyrdom that inspired revival. It was an erasure that taught a lesson. Faith had limits, and power had learned where they were. The execution of Jacques de Molay has often been wrapped in legend. Curses, prophecies, divine vengeance. But these stories emerged later. because the reality was too unsettling. The truth was simpler and colder. Nothing happened. God did not intervene. The monarchy did not fall. The papacy did not collapse. History did not pause, and that silence was the real verdict. It meant that faith alone was no longer enough to protect institutions. It meant that obedience to procedure now outweighed loyalty to belief. It meant that the sacred could be extinguished without shaking the world. The Templars had believed their vows bound heaven and earth together. They were wrong. Their execution marked the end of a certain illusion. That religious authority existed outside political consequence. That faith could stand apart from power. That devotion created immunity. From this moment forward, every religious institution in Europe understood the risk. Survival would require compromise, alignment, silence. The fire on the Seine did not purify faith. It disciplined it. And in that discipline, a new relationship was forged. Between belief and authority. Between conscience and compliance. Between God and those who claim to govern in His name. The execution of Jacques de Molay did not close a chapter. It signaled a transition. Faith would continue, but it would no longer stand alone. The trial of the Templars did not end with fire. It ended with a method. And methods, once proven effective, do not disappear. They spread. What Europe learned from the fall of the Templars was not how to defeat heresy. It learned how to manage faith. For centuries, religious authority had claimed a position above politics. Kings ruled bodies. The church ruled souls. The Templars belonged to that older world, a world where vows mattered more than statutes, where obedience to God outranked obedience to kings. That world did not collapse overnight. But with the trial of the Templars, it was irreversibly breached. From that moment on, faith could be questioned without open blasphemy, investigated without theological debate, dismantled without declaring war on God. This was the blueprint. In later centuries, rulers would use it again. Not always against religious orders, sometimes against bishops, sometimes against monasteries, sometimes against entire confessions. But the structure remained the same. First, accusation framed as protection. Second, legal process framed as purification. Third, dissolution framed as necessity. Never call it persecution. Call it order. This logic would reappear in the Reformation, in the wars of religion, in the slow emergence of centralized states that tolerated belief but demanded obedience. Faith did not vanish. It was contained. The Templars had believed that divine legitimacy was stronger than political calculation. They believed wrong. After them, religious institutions learned to adapt, to negotiate, to submit quietly when necessary. Because survival now depended not on sanctity, but on alignment. The irony is difficult to escape. The Church survived the trial of the Templars, but it survived changed. It emerged less absolute, more cautious, more dependent on cooperation with secular power. And in that dependency, a slow transformation began. Europe did not become secular in 1307. But it learned something crucial: that the sacred could be administrated. That belief could exist inside political systems rather than above them. This realization would eventually lead to the end of crusading ideology, to the separation, never complete, never clean, between church and state, to a world where faith endured, but no longer ruled uncontested. The trial of the Templars was not the cause of these changes, but it was the proof that they were possible. And that is why this story still matters, not because of treasure, not because of secret rites, but because it reveals the moment when Europe learned how to discipline belief without destroying it. The Templars did not fall because they were corrupt. They fell because they belonged to a world that was ending, a world where faith was authority, a world where vows were protection, a world where obedience flowed upward to God, not outward to institutions. The new world would be colder, more procedural, more stable, and far less forgiving. The courtroom replaced the battlefield. The document replaced the sword. The verdict replaced the miracle. Faith survived, but it survived on new terms. That is the final legacy of the Templars. Not martyrdom, not mystery, but a warning. When faith becomes inconvenient to power, it will not be attacked directly. It will be examined, recorded, reframed, and quietly removed. Europe never forgot that lesson. It refined it, repeated it, institutionalized it. And every time faith collided with authority afterward, the shadow of the Templars was there. In the silence, in the paperwork, in the verdict already written. This was not the death of belief. It was the death of belief without power. And that is why the trial of the Templars marks the beginning of the modern relationship between faith and the state. A relationship built not on revelation, but on control.